Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to share my review of the Kodak RETO Ektar H35N, a heavily updated version of the H35 which I spoke about last year. Let's get into it. So full disclosure, I reached out to RETO to ask about a review sample so I could do a comparison between this camera and the original version, and they actually just sent me this camera. So do bear that in mind as you go through the video. It's a final production sample, I've had it since before release, but they don't get any input in the video's content or production and they don't get to see it before it goes live. The H35N is a version 2, essentially, of the H35, so they do share a lot of things in common. So let's start by looking at the things that are the same. Both are manufactured by RETO under the Kodak name, use standard 35mm film with a pseudo quick load system that is very user-friendly and easy to understand. Both shoot half-frame images with a 4:3 vertical aspect ratio, taking twice as many photos per roll as a standard 35mm camera. This gets you 48 exposures per roll if you're shooting 24 exposure rolls, or 72 if using a standard 36 exposure roll. Both cameras are point and shoots with a flash that you turn on and off when you want, and they are both powered by a single AAA battery. And both have 22mm fixed prime lenses said to be much higher quality than those found in disposables and other lower priced reusable point and shoot cameras. Compared to the H35, RETO list a lot of improvements with the H35N, though there are a few others they don't list on their website that I'll get to later. The H35N has an updated lens formula with one coated glass element and one spherical acrylic element, and now has a brighter max aperture of f8 instead of f9.5. It has an aluminium front plate that adds a little bit of weight but significantly more rigidity to the body, and it makes it feel a lot nicer in the hands as a result. A tripod socket on the bottom means you can now attach the camera to a tripod to be used with a threaded cable release so that you can fire the shutter on bulk mode for long exposures or multiple exposures. The last new actual feature advertised is an optional 4-pointed star filter that you can use to add some flair to your images if that's your jam. Personally, it's not for me. Lastly, a lot more colors across 2 different style ranges, and I know this isn't really a feature, but aesthetics matter with this kind of camera. When I was given a choice, I opted for the black pinstripe look because I think that looks the classiest. Unboxing is a fairly standard affair as you get the camera, QR codes for the quick start guide and a tutorial video which are hosted online, a lanyard and carry pouch, and no AAA battery, so you have to supply that yourself. As this is a half-frame camera, you're getting twice as many photos per roll, which means you're spending half as much on the cost of film, development, and scanning. And the more you use this camera, the more you're going to save compared to a normal full-frame point and shoot as time goes on. The lens is a tremendous step up, with the main benefit I would say being how even the image quality is across the frame. With the original camera, it was kind of sharp in the center, and as soon as you went off-center, image quality fell apart very quickly. Here, it's much more even, and though it does get softer in the corners, it's still a huge improvement. It's still not going to match something like an Olympus Pen or a Canon Demi camera with their complex all-glass optics, but it's still much better. And I would say it's more than good enough for the type of camera this is for the intended market. One of my many complaints with the original camera was that if you charge the flash and then turn the flash off, it would still fire when you take the next photo. This has been fixed with this camera so that the flash is fully disconnected when you turn that dial to the off position, so the flash doesn't fire unnecessarily and potentially ruin a photo. The addition of bulk mode in addition to the standard 1/100th of a second shutter speed is great and opens up new creative opportunities for like low light and night photography, landscape photography using slower film, or potentially even mixing ambient light with flash. There are now 2 aperture settings, which is twice as many as one in the original model. Whereas the original camera had a fixed aperture of f9.5, this lens has a max aperture of f8, and there is an aperture disc that sits in place in the middle of the optical formula when you are not using the flash, so that you get the maximum image quality, I presume, though in my testing I didn't see a tremendous difference between f8 and f11. And then when you turn the flash dial, which is harder to turn than on the original, the aperture disc moves out of the way and you get the full benefit and light gathering power of f8. I guess it's just assumed that if you're using the flash, you're probably illuminating a central subject, like your friend or partner, or like your dog, and then the image quality in the corners is less important. Though again, I don't see a tremendous difference, and it's just nice to have two options. Separate from general image quality improvements, flare resistance in particular gets its own point, because it was a severe weakness of the original camera and I had a lot of images that were just ruined by veiling flare and loss of contrast that you couldn't see because you're not composing through the lens. With the new optical formula and that coated glass lens, flare resistance is basically fine, and I would say it's essentially fixed. The loading and rewind system has been heavily redesigned and it is so much better. Here's a video of me trying to load film into the original camera, and it's a fairly finicky and involved process, and that spool that you have to pull out, it's just not very sturdy and it feels like you're gonna break the camera. For comparison, here I am loading film into the new camera. It really is that easy. And in addition, the rewind lever has been reinforced with a bit of metal and it's a lot thicker, so it feels a lot better and less like you're gonna snap and torque the camera when you're actually rewinding your film, which again is a huge overall improvement to the build quality. The viewfinder has been redesigned and is no longer just a 35mm finder with translucent masks on either side to approximately mask off the half-frame imaging area. Aside from aesthetics, I did have one friend who struggled to figure out what those grey bars on either side of the viewfinder were actually for, so there is, to some people, a material benefit of this more deliberately and consciously designed viewfinder. The last thing I want to say is that the shot counter has been redesigned and raised up closer to the top of the camera, so it is significantly easier to read under a wider range of lighting conditions. Although most of these are shared with the original H35, I do want to be thorough. The single shutter speed of 1/100th of a second is an understandable compromise for a point-and-shoot type camera that doesn't have any electronic automation in it, but it still means you're relying very heavily on the latitude of your film. Something like Portra is going to perform a lot better in this camera than something like Kodak Gold, Harman Phoenix, or say Fomapan versus HP5. You know, the choice of film that you use does still matter because you are still okay, you have two aperture settings, which gives you an extra stop of usable range, which is not to be sniffed at, but still, having only one shutter speed is not ideal. Though again, for this type of camera, it's an understandable compromise. It's still a fixed focus camera and you can't focus the lens in any way, so you're relying on the depth of field of that 22mm lens. Though to a certain degree, the f11 aperture with the aperture disc in place does increase your depth of field versus the f9.5 of the original. The higher image quality of the new lens means you see that depth of field fall off and things go out of focus a little bit more easily. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, and I'm not sure how useful this would be as kind of a lightweight, easy landscape camera. You know, if you were shooting mountains in a valley on a hike, I honestly don't know if the images would actually come out that well, but that will depend on your intended use case. For Instagram and the like, no problem. Small prints, probably fine. But if you're doing any level of zooming and pixel peeping, I genuinely think the depth of field isn't going to be good enough because the lens is almost too good and kind of betrays that. At the time of recording, I don't know the final European pricing, but the American pricing has increased from $50 with the original camera to $65 with this camera, and though it does bring a lot more features to the table, that 30% price hike is going to be hard to stomach for quite a few people. There's still no multiple exposure option for normal photographs. You can do multiple exposures in bulb mode just by pushing the cable release multiple times, but I feel like the target market, and me personally as well, would like the opportunity to do it with normal photographs. Though I understand that the way the mechanism is designed, advancing the film is what cocks the shutter, so you couldn't do one without doing the other. I know that would mean a fairly substantial redesign of the camera, but it is still something that this camera lacks. Lastly, a year later, I still think the flash dial turns the wrong way, and turning it towards the flash should turn it on and away should turn it off, not the way that it actually works now. It's very petty, but it annoys me. So RETO obviously took on board a lot of feedback from a lot of people after the release of the H35 in order to create this camera. And I have a few suggestions that I think are reasonable and would keep it more or less in line with this kind of thing. You know, I'm not going to suggest interchangeable lenses and, you know, oh, give it a Nikon F-mount. That would be silly. But I have two suggestions that I think would be very easy to introduce, and a third that I think is reasonable to consider as an option. The first I would say is to disconnect the flash from this dial here and keep this as just an aperture plate and introduce a switch on top of the camera that people can use for the flash. I think that would be very easy for people to figure out and understand, and though it would change the aesthetics a little bit, make it a bit less sleek, it would increase usability overall by disconnecting the flash from the aperture, giving you a lot more creative control. The image quality is not so drastically different between f8 and f11. I think that if someone just sets it to one of them and leaves it there forever and just relies on the flash, that would still work fine with the latitude of most film and the increased quality of this camera versus its competitors. The second thing I would suggest is to add another lever like this one for the star filter on the underside of the lens and make it a scale focus camera. Give us just two zones, far and close, and that would increase the usability again and let us take advantage of this coated glass lens and let it shine a bit more. It's a good lens, but it's just hampered by the fact that you've got that fixed focusing distance. The third, and again one that I don't think is going to happen, would be to find a way to introduce multiple exposures, please. That's it for my review of the Kodak RETO Ektar H35N. Again, this camera is a tremendous improvement over the original, as I hope I've successfully demonstrated. And if you're in the market for a point-and-shoot camera and don't want to spend the money on something like an Olympus Mu 2, something like this could be a strong contender. If you do specifically want a plastic fantastic, I am very confident in saying that at this point in time, this is by far the best option on the market. The fact that it's half frame is just a bonus in addition to its general features and overall quality. And although there are improvements that I would suggest for a version 3, I'm actually looking forward to using this camera a lot more than I was using the H35. Thanks again to RETO for sending me this camera, even though I was just looking for a loaner. Thanks to you for watching. That's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shako1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.